I don't think that I'd seen more activity on X than ever before either. Like I was getting stupid impressions on around those few weeks. So it just goes to show the scale and, just the limit of reach. It's quite interesting. Anyway.
It certainly is. I think there's probably a number of ways that we can work to grow our domestic audience, for launches from the United States. And we'll note that briefly, we're now T minus 1 hour, 11 minutes, 26 seconds and counting. LOX loading has been underway for about a minute and a half onto ship 25. So that was the last big fueling milestone that had yet to begin. So now tanking is underway on all 4 of the main propellant tanks for the Starship rockets. So we are well on our way towards hopefully getting a launch at 7 o'clock this morning. Do want to just make a broad ask for those who are enjoying the conversation and the live coverage this morning. If you haven't already and you're watching on either the Lab Padre stream or Space Flight Now, if you can go ahead and give this stream a like, it's a great way to support both of our channels, what we're doing here, and it allows the YouTube algorithm to spread the coverage, as we were just talking about, attracting more folks to big launches like this, and want to bring more folks into the conversation. Taking a quick peek at the super chats here. Want to thank Pete 2.0, one of the Lab Padre YouTube super chats, with a $5 Australian dollar donation. Thank you so much, Pete. Saying fresh coffee for all, and I'm sure we are all being powered by caffeine this morning. I know I've got my energy drink by my side, keeping me as concentrated as I can for now. Michael E. Dennis with a $5 super chat from Lab Stream saying, let's start the donation train, go Starship and SpaceX. And yes, really appreciate the super chats. Not only does it help bring more folks actively into the conversation talking about space flight, whether it's about this particular Starship launch, or if you have other questions that you'd all like to have us address, be sure to pose that in the super chat feature here. You also help support our coverage. We really appreciate that. Moving on down the line with a Superman P. Witherspoon with a $5 New Zealand dollar donation saying, will you have advertising in the last few minutes as NASA spaceflight did with ITV-F1? No, we are not going to interrupt the most important part before the launch with advertising. I think that would be a foolish move, and we're not going to break the stream, as it were, with a last minute ad break. So we're going to charge on for the next hour, 8 minutes plus, as we get towards liftoff of this Starship rocket. Moving on down the line, $10 super chat from our Spaceflight Now side of the stream. Says, Will, can you ask Lab what a Buc-ee's is? Buc-ee's is a really popular, think of it like a mini Costco and a gas station all rolled into one. But Lab, do you want to hop on the mic, and for the folks that are not familiar with the cultural phenomenon that is spreading across the Southeast of what Buc-ee's is? Bit of a tangent from spaceflight activities, but briefly.
Yeah, Buc-ee's is a huge entity down here in Texas. Big rest stop for truckers, people that are commuting back and forth from different cities around Texas. It is a huge phenomenon. People love it. It's has some of the cleanest restrooms and very nice facilities. So yeah, Buc-ee's is high end down here in Texas.
Do you ever see a T-shirt or piece of paraphernalia with a very happy-go-lucky beaver? That is the Buc-ee's logo. So thanks for the super chat donation, Gucci Pilot, one of our channel members. Glad to have you on board this morning. We'll come back to the super chats in just a moment, but we are now T-minus 1 hour, 7 minutes, 18 seconds and counting as we continue on down the pathway towards liftoff. Want to take a step back and talk about sort of the evolution. We've talked a lot about the where the rocket has come since the first integrated flight test, sort of what we're anticipating for the milestones in this flight. Guys, let's talk a little bit about Starbase writ large, because we know it's going to be expanding over the next several months, several years, as launch operations really start to ramp up. Zach, we'll start with you. We know that there will be a second OLM that will come online. It'll be a big part of future demonstration missions like the propellant tank-to-tank transfer, and obviously as they gear up for the support of Artemis missions, Artemis 3 and 4. Let's talk a little bit about what Starbase is going to look like on the road to getting that additional capacity online.
Yeah, I think one of the most exciting things that's happened over the last few days is just us being surprised by the fact that it does appear that they're in the process of getting started on that second launch pad. So it's almost right on the heels of the Fish and Wildlife report. The very same day we started seeing the first sections of that next integration tower show up. So they've done a massive amount of work within the production site to speed up their actual manufacturing process. So right now, I think on some of the cameras you guys may be able to see, depending on the lighting right now, the new mega bay that is nearing completion out there. The Star Factory is also deep into construction right now, and that alone is about twice as large as we were initially expecting. So the amount of vehicles that they're currently able to produce is about to essentially double, and eventually I think we'll also see the Kennedy Space Center come online as far as their production site out there. So just overall their capacity to produce these rockets is increasing, and at some point they are going to need the additional capacity to actually launch them as well. And it seems like they're getting ahead on that game, and are already starting to work on laying the groundwork for that next tower. So I think that's going to be one of the most exciting things that we'll see after this launch, is the mad dash to get that second tower constructed. And I think the interesting thing, which was mentioned in the Fish and Wildlife report, is that they're not expecting any interruptions to their launch cadence, which I don't know if you can really consider it a cadence, considering that they're only really cleared for about 5 launches a year. So I think that would be a little bit more of a concern down in Florida, but out here it's really probably not going to be a huge interruption. So it's going to be pretty amazing watching them build another tower down here. Any of you who have traveled down here and actually got to stand next to the launch tower at all, I think we're all pretty equally excited about what it's going to look like here in the near future once they get that other tower constructed.
Yeah, before Marcus, you jump in here. Oh, sorry to cut you off, Marcus. Just want to make a couple of quick notes that we're starting to see first light here at Starbase, as the first little rays of sunlight are starting to crest over the horizon. Also have NASA's observing plane, which is inbound. Of course, this mission will be important on the pathway towards the human landing system version of Starship, and NASA has been very much involved with the development of Starship as it gets closer and closer to needing to be used for HLS missions on Artemis 3 and 4. And obviously we've got the uncrewed landing demonstration before that. But Marcus, before we go too far down the Artemis rabbit hole, your thoughts on Starbase?
Oh yeah, look, the expansion plans have always sort of been there, at least over the last few years, and I've always wondered whether it will actually expand or whether it was just them obtaining the approvals to expand if they wanted to. But yeah, it's a very positive sign to see these tower sections coming in, and even since I talked about it in my last video last night, there's been more sections show up. So that's really cool to see. I suppose there's a little bit of debate about whether they're building the 8th section here and then shipping the rest down to join it from the Cape, or whether they're building it here because they've got the staff here to do it and shipping that one over to the Cape. But I don't believe the second is probably the case. I think it's more likely that they're going to bring the new tower, all these tower pieces down. So what's interesting is they seem to be doing this well before any sort of work on the ground and foundations for us. I'm like, well, it seems odd that we wouldn't have seen a lot of expansion work already starting, but maybe they're simply waiting for this flight to go well before they sort of start ripping into that. Maybe we'll see huge construction just immediately jump in and start happening after this flight. Who knows? It's interesting to see.
Absolutely. And as we continue on this conversation, we're now coming up on the 1 hour mark, getting a great panning view of Starship launch vehicle. You can see some of the vapor right against the sides of the Super Heavy booster there. You see one of the fins there in the center of your screen. Want to bring in an additional voice, very familiar to our Spaceflight Now audience. Returning for a cameo on the mic, we have Stephen Clark, who is now an ace space reporter over at Ars Technica. Fortunate enough to be on the ground with us here again for his second time seeing Starship launch. Stephen, welcome to the broadcast. Good to have you back on the channel.
Good to be here. Good morning, Will.
Good morning. Now you got a little bit of sleep before we really got this thing started. We were talking last night about the pathway that Starship will have after this flight test. Obviously, NASA, as we mentioned, watching this mission very closely. They've been tracking a lot of the upgrades that SpaceX has been making, both to the Starship vehicle that's going to fly, the next one's coming after it. You actually had the opportunity to talk with Lisa Watson-Morgan, who heads up the Human Landing System program, earlier this week. What was she kind of looking for and watching to learn from this flight test that we're having today?
Well, I think, in a perfect world, she wants to see them make it to space and make it to, I guess, near orbital velocity as if everything goes perfectly. That's what they'll do with Starship this morning is get up near orbital velocity, fly about 3/4 of the way around the world and splash down in Hawaii. So that would be a perfect outcome. It goes without saying, really. But in terms of what one thing that she pointed out, one thing that NASA is really eager to see is an improvement in the reliability of the Raptor engine. I think they had 5 or 6 engines that either failed to ignite or shut down in flight on the first flight test back in April. I think seeing no or at least fewer Raptor engines fail on this flight on the booster will be a forward step. And I think getting to staging and getting through the hot staging, I think if they make it through that, I think that's a win, in my opinion. And I think that's what NASA feels too. But there's a lot of testing that needs to come on Starship, and none of that can happen until it has a successful orbital flight test. And those tests include some propellant transfer demonstrations that could occur toward the end of next year if this flight test is successful. But if Starship doesn't make it to space, doesn't make it to that near orbital velocity target, they'll have to do it again. And they have a lot of hardware here at Starship waiting in the wings to fly. But I think it's unlikely we'd see another orbital flight test this year. So that would delay things by some number of months.
Yeah, and all you have to do is just drive in really past the production site here at Starbase, and you can see all the flight hardware that's in buildings, out of buildings, as you mentioned, very ready and eager to get off the ground. We are now T-minus 57 minutes, 57 seconds and counting. Taking a look up the vehicle just beneath the quick disconnect, you see a frost ring forming on ship 25 as fueling continues to get underway. Zach, we were talking a little bit about some of the upgrades that were made to the Super Heavy booster to prevent some of the fires that were seen on the first integrated flight test. You've had the opportunity to look through the documents and the 63 action items that SpaceX has been overseeing as part of its mishap investigation. Kind of key into some of the ones that are most specifically impacting the intent to prevent both future fires as well as failures of the Raptor engines?
Yeah, I would say that one of the biggest things that they may not necessarily be able to prevent right now is actual engine explosions. You know, that they've come a long way with testing on the Raptor engines, especially at McGregor. You know, do just constant engine tests going every single day. But I guess it seems to be a slightly different once you put them on the vehicle. You're transferring a massive amount of propellant to those engines all at one time. So I think they're still have a little bit of work to do with, you know, making sure that the engines are performing optimally during flight. However, you know, in the event that they seem to suffer some explosive shutdown, you want to make sure that they're not taking out their neighbor, which is something that happened on the last flight. I think we saw, I actually still remember the engine numbers. Engine 19 during the last flight exploded, and that actually took out the shielding for engines 20, engine 18, and engine 17, which is pretty massive explosion to take out the shielding on the 4, or I guess 3 adjacent engines. And I think as a result, engine 18 actually ended up shutting down shortly after that. You know, so making sure that they have additional shielding. I think they've essentially doubled the amount of shielding that they have in between the engines. It's essentially like a containment box that surrounds the engine. So they've doubled the amount of shielding. So ideally, we shouldn't have to worry about shrapnel penetrating through those walls or overpressures from the engine explosions blowing out those walls. And so, you know, I guess the goal behind that is, you know, if you can't prevent necessarily engine explosions, you want to make sure you're actually able to at least contain them, so it's, you know, a localized event and it doesn't kind of cause a cascading failure essentially. But beyond that, some of those explosions that occurred during the last flight were actual gas explosions. So, you know, you have leaks that develop from the actual engines, and you know, because they're in that contained space, you got to worry about a buildup of gas. And, you know, it's one thing if you have methane gas building up in there, but it's a completely different situation if you have oxygen building up in there as well. So one of the big items that they mentioned in 2 separate occasions on that report was to increase their fire suppression capacity by 15x. And that is something that we've seen tested on pretty much every static fire, every spin prime, and also during the wet dress rehearsal for Booster 9 is that fire suppression system. So it's a very large two large CO2 tanks that they added onto the side of the booster, and they obviously fill those before flight. And we, from our understanding, they should be purging the engine compartments for the entire boost phase of flight, which is, I think, guessing here, but roughly about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So they ideally should be neutralizing any explosive mixtures that are in there, and, you know, preventing explosions like we saw happen on the last flight. So I think in that regard, things should go a lot better this time. Like, even if the actual performance of the Raptors themselves was the same, we shouldn't see collateral damage occur, which overall I think will make this flight go a lot better than last time. And, you know, I do want to just add that we have some fog rolling in right now. You know, we're hoping for clear skies, so maybe we'll still get that, but right now we do have a little bank of fog rolling in. It's not as bad as it could be, but it's definitely there. So maybe some of you guys are seeing that depending on which view you're looking at on the live stream cameras, but from our view, it's starting to get slightly sad in that regard.
It's a pretty epic sight to see, though. You've got that lit up view now. It's always amazing, you know, because it's happening so quickly. This morning, we're only less than 50 minutes. We're really only, what, 20, 25 minutes or something away from the SpaceX team actually streaming their own views of this, which, you know, they've got they've got the great ability to have cameras wherever they want. So yeah, we should be seeing different perspectives pretty soon. But this is still a magic shot for me.
Yeah, it's great to see little Hopper in the foreground against its much more evolved cousin standing ready to launch fairly soon. And both question, I guess, to Zach and Stephen. You were both here, of course, for the first integrated flight test. I guess briefly bring us back for your experiences of that first launch, seeing it fly as, you know, a fully integrated Starship rocket, and, you know, just the feeling of getting to now, and how you're feeling about how everything has evolved to this point. And Stephen, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I was here back in April for the first orbital flight test of Starship, and you know, there were a lot of long faces and sad eyes around Starbase after that, particularly after they saw some of the damage at the pad. A lot of people had some worst case scenarios in their mind that you know, there wouldn't be another launch this year. But pretty quickly, SpaceX got moving, as they always do, with repairing the pad, and they had a plan in place to install that water deluge system under the launch mount, and that was active and being tested in the middle of the summer. So SpaceX was ready to fly toward the end of summer, early fall, and you know, one of the big holdups that we've talked about is waiting for that FAA license, and you know, SpaceX has said that the FAA licensing process is actually in the critical path for having the Starship as a lander for the Artemis program. So that was pretty remarkable to hear from SpaceX a few weeks back. But yeah, here in April for this first launch, I was at this location for that launch, and there was actually a rogue cloud that was directly over the launch pad. So we lost sight of Starship within 20 seconds or so after it lifted off. But one thing that stuck with me is the sound of the launch, and I cannot wait to experience that again. The sound, I've seen something like 250, maybe a little more than 250 launches in my career, and seeing this launch was next level, to be honest with you, Will. And it was really spectacular, and had a really low pitch, low frequency rumble, and I can't wait to hear it again.
How did it compare to SLS for you?
The sound is different for sure. I was about the same distance from the Artemis 1 launch in Florida, and that launch, the SLS has those two big solid rocket boosters, which has more of a slightly higher pitch, kind of a crackle sound, still very, very loud. But growing up as a kid, watching documentaries and old videos of the Saturn V, this thing sounds like the Saturn V, in my opinion. I never saw one, but I've seen lots of videos, and it reminded me of that sound.
Yeah, I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of that. I'm excited to experience it again. I would say, you know, watching it from this location is pretty intense. We are, I think, about 3.7 miles away from the launch site, which almost feels illegal, I would say. You know, it's pretty intense right now. I think without even, I don't need to really zoom my camera too much. I can see the full stack very, very well from this spot. And I would say last time around, it was, in my opinion, kind of terrifying. I don't know what everybody else thinks, but you know, from this angle, we were able to see the lean of the booster. Like, you know, I remember very, very clearly watching through the lens of my camera, and it leaned over pretty much immediately after it left the pad, and it wasn't climbing very fast. I think a lot of us have been expecting it to essentially jump off the pad, you know, similar to the space shuttle. The space shuttle had a pretty quick ascent off of the pad, and so we were kind of expecting the same thing for Starship. But I guess with those 3 engines out, and they may have been a little bit lower throttle than what they initially planned to be, it seemed to climb very slowly, and that 20 seconds before it disappeared into the clouds kind of felt like an hour, honestly. You know, I'm excited this time around. It seems like we have clear skies at least above the pad, and we'll be able to see it throughout its entire boost phase. And I think we'll get some pretty awesome views this time around. But you know, I got fingers crossed for myself that it's not as dramatic as it was last time. You know, I think even from this far away, I was able to see concrete in the air, flying, you know, chunks of concrete flying through the air, and that's one thing that I don't think we'll have to worry about this time around. So I think things are looking good.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of their preparations that were made from last time to this time should be robust enough to prevent a cratering underneath the orbital launch mount. We'll keep our eyes open for that, and hopefully we don't see a repeat of last time where that's concerned. Now T-minus 46 minutes, 56 seconds and counting. Want to pop back into the live stream. Thank a few more folks for super chat donations. As a reminder, it's a great way to join in the conversation. If you have any questions for any of the folks that are joining in the commentary, we'd love to answer your topics or questions. So please be sure to put those in the YouTube super chat feature, either on the Spaceflight Now or the Lab Padres side. Love to bring you to the conversation. Superman P. Witherspoon with a $10 New Zealand donation. Thank you so much, Superman. Says, love the ad-free streams, and we're more than happy to bring those to you. Appreciate you helping to make that happen. Kitter's Refuge with a 70 ZAR donation. No comment, just support. Really appreciate that, Kitter's Refuge. Thank you so much. Tector in Space. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that first word there, Tector, with a 10-pound super chat, the pound sterling comment. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the support. Nelson Reyes, one of our regulars on the Spaceflight Now streams, the $10 super chat. Thank you so much, Nelson. Says, once again, thanks for the great coverage, and want to take a quick beat to thank all of the folks that are helping to make this happen, both on the Lab Padre as well as the Spaceflight Now side. There's a great team working very hard behind the scenes to make this all come to fruition. So really appreciate the work of all the great folks that are working to make this happen. So thanks for the recognition on that, Nelson. Erna with a 20,000 IDR super chat donation. Thank you so much, Erna. My conversion off the top of my head is not quite fast enough to make that switch over to US dollars, but really appreciate the generous support. Thank you so much. Alan McKeithen with a $5 super chat says, thanks for the commentary to you all. Let's go. And yes, it is quite the treat to be joined by Marcus, Zach, and Steven this morning, as well as Lab from time to time. So really appreciate these guys taking the time to be a part of the coverage this morning. Always great to have their friendship and insight, especially on launch as dynamic as this one.
Pleasure.
We'll go ahead and come back to the conversation as we are still getting some great views of the Starship rocket as fueling continues underway. Now T-minus 44 minutes and counting. Before we jump back into the conversation in full, and I do want to talk more about this element on the other side, want to talk about sort of the flight path and the trajectory of this particular mission, because we are certainly hoping to see it go beyond stage separation, the point at which we didn't see for the first integrated flight test. So the folks over on the Lab Padre side helped create this great launch profile animation. As you see the Starship liftoff, or this is from SpaceX. Separated, we'll do a boost back maneuver. Of course, we're all watching for that all important hot staging operation. It'll be a first for Starship. For those watching from down in the Miami area, you might be able to see Starship thread the needle as it coast between the southern tip of Florida and Cuba, flying overhead. If all goes well, for a nominal flight, it will splash down off the coast of Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean, a little bit north of there. So bringing the conversation back out to the three of you, we'll go back in sort of opposite direction. Marcus, we'll start with you. We all have hopes and expectations for, you know, getting through a fully nominal mission and seeing ships splash down in the Pacific off the coast of Hawaii. What do you feel like will be the most challenging portion of this flight profile? Is it sort of what we're thinking that it is, getting through hot staging, or is there another element that you're also watching for?
Hot staging for me is certainly a critical part, and you know that there's apprehension about that by many people because it is so new. But the one thing I think, if they can get past that, I think that there's a very good chance that they'll get all the way to orbit, because I mean, once you've got the engines fired up, as long as they're burning normally and happily away, usually there's not too much else that's going to interrupt things until you get to orbit. The one thing I'm really interested to see is the acceleration, and we'll be able to analyze that based on the readouts from the you know, the speed that SpaceX will show. So we'll be able to sort of figure out a rough thrust to weight ratio and all that sort of thing. I'm not sure whether they're going to really punch this thing. They're going to fire it up to 90% engines on all those 33, assuming that they can fire all 33. You know, we haven't seen them actually have all 33 really go collectively successfully at this stage. I'm pretty sure we haven't. So there's a big question there. You know, are we just going to see 31 engines, 32 engines? Will we see all 33 going? Because it could also be, remember, that in a static fire, they've probably got much stricter conditions as to when an engine will simply stop firing. There can be 1,000 things wrong with engine pressure systems and flow and all this kind of stuff. And maybe in a static fire, they make those cutoffs very, very strict and particular. Whereas in flight, when they're more critical, maybe a lot of those checks and balances that will auto shut down engines is largely negated by the criticality of the thing. So that's going to be a big thing for me. How many engines we see actually leaving the pad? Hopefully all of them, and then the acceleration that we see, because it as Zach said before, it's a pretty scary sight seeing a rocket of that size just kind of crawling off the pad ever so slowly, and you think, my gosh, I hope this thing doesn't veer away. So you know, we don't want to think negative about any of these things. They've done so much in terms of upgrading since the last flight, and I really think that we will at least see a successful flight up to stage separation and hopefully all the way to orbit. Of course, after that, the big thing is the heat shield, which is the big point of contention. And I don't think anybody really believes we're going to see all those tiles hold all the way to orbit. So that's going to be very interesting to see. What are your thoughts, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as heat shield goes, that's one of the lower items on my personal list. I think anything that happens with the ship is bonus. You know what I mean? You know, the hot staging, I think, is going to take center stage this time if they make it to stage separation. So, you know, I'm really excited. Hopefully, we'll have a good view of that when that happens. But I would say that may be the scariest part of the flight, maybe. You know, there's about 3 different ways that can fail. They have the possibility of failing in max Q with that hot stage ring. There's also the possibility of the ship destroying the hot stage ring and the booster in the process. And there's also a possibility of overpressure within the aft section of the ship as a result of potentially, you know, not enough mass flow out of the hot stage ring and, you know, causing some sort of overpressure within the skirt of the ship. So lots of things that could go wrong, and I think it's going to be pretty interesting watching that in action. Because this is one of those items where it's not necessarily a reaction of anything that happened during the first flight. It's just something that kind of came along that SpaceX was like, all right, well, this is what we want to do. You know, they didn't get a chance to do stage separation last time, but you know, I guess through their own simulations and you know, overall principles of physics, they decided that this is something that they wanted to do. So you know, the amount of testing I think that went into this was about as much as they could do. They did some structural verification testing on the hot stage ring, which should cover the whole max Q concern, I would say. They should be pretty confident that they won't have to worry about it collapsing during max Q. You know, I would say in that regard, one of the only other things that could happen if they end up doing somersaults through the air like they did last time, they may not be, I don't think they tested for that kind of loading, but as far as actual max Q testing, I think they're pretty set as far as that goes. But you know, you really can't simulate what's going to happen once the engines ignite on top of that ring. I think it would have been interesting to see an actual static fire test with the ship on top of that ring, but that's not really realistic when it comes to in-flight conditions. You know, you're going to be at a much higher altitude. You're you know, you can't really simulate that on the ground. So this is one of those kind of tests that really just has to be done in flight. So I think that's going to be one of the more exciting things is, you know, seeing something like this that there's really a lot of question marks on how it's actually going to end up working. So me personally, that's
yeah, I
one
mean,
of the
I'm
things
still not
most
sure,
excited
you know,
for.
like, are we going to see all 6 engines fire up? Are we going to see the outer vacuums fire up just to try to get it away? And then the sea levels fire up straight after? I don't know if we've really seen any evidence to suggest that we know what that answer is. To me, it always seemed logical that they would fire up the 3 vacuums, but I don't know if that would be enough thrust to then get it away from the booster alone. Because the booster, remember, is quite empty. The thrust to weight, even with 3 engines running at minimal thrust, is probably still reasonably significant. And you've got a big, heavy ship on top, which, granted, doesn't have a payload. So hopefully, maybe 3 engines would be more than enough. But yeah, it's very interesting to me how that's going to work.
Absolutely. And just to jump in here as a time marker, now T-minus 35 minutes, coming up on 35 seconds as well. We should have the SpaceX feed starting in about 30 seconds or so. Imagine they will have their own commentary, so we more than likely won't have dedicated mission audio feeds even when SpaceX does come up, but we will keep tabs on that. And as some of the launch control call outs coming through the loops, we will of course bring those into you, hopefully via audio. And if we need to take a pause, we will pause to listen, and we will try to not talk over SpaceX's mission updates there. Want to make sure that we're getting the most accurate and up-to-date information, so we'll be cognizant of that as that gets underway. Stephen, do you want to go back to a point that Marcus was making a moment ago about sort of the preparation for this first flight, the fact that in the static fires of the Super Heavy booster, we still haven't seen all 33 engines fire at once, ever. Is that concerning at all in your mind, or do you feel like, given the amount of information and data that SpaceX gathered from those static fire tests, that it's sufficient? I mean, apparently it's sufficient enough for them to launch today, but how are you sort of thinking about that element of this?
Well, in terms of today, I would not be surprised at all if we see 1 or 2 engines not firing when it lifts off the pad. I think in the long run, you know, they've gotten close to having 33 engines. I think there were 2 that misfired on the most recent static fire of Super Heavy back in late August. I think that was the most they've had. So it's 31 engines. That was the most they've had fire at once. But if I recall, maybe Marcus or Zach can remember, I think that was like at half thrust, half throttle. And so it'll be really interesting to see how many engines are firing when it lifts off, and do they lose any during ascent. Zach was talking a little earlier about some of the shielding they've put in the engine bay to prevent kind of this concern about cascading failures, like if one engine has a problem or catches fire, that it doesn't spread to the neighboring or adjacent engines in those rings at the bottom of the booster. So I think that's something to watch as well. If they lose an engine, do they lose only one, or does it start affecting engines that are nearby? Because we saw on the first test flight back in April, the engines that they lost, some of them were right next to one another. So that was clearly a sign, probably that, you know, one engine may have been fine. It just succumbed to something that happened next to the engine next to it. One other thing that I would point out, we're talking about things to watch for. I wholeheartedly agree with what Zach and Marcus were saying about the engine reliability, the hot staging, the heat shield. Another thing, Marcus kind of hinted at this, was lighting the Raptor engines on Starship. SpaceX hasn't ignited a Raptor engine in a near vacuum of space before. And we've seen a couple of new rockets this year have problems at upper stage ignition. Japan's H3 rocket, as well as their Relativity Terran 1, both flew fine through the boost phase, and the engine didn't light on the upper stage. So I'm really curious to see how that ignition goes on the Raptor engines on Starship. Are there 3 firing? Are there 6 firing right off the bat? And how that goes, because they've never ignited a Raptor engine in a near vacuum, as this would be, you know, a couple 100,000 feet above the Earth, very low air pressure as well at that altitude. So we'll see how that works if they make it that far. Hopefully they do.
And before Zach and Marcus, you jump back in, just want to make a quick programming note. You see our countdown clock at the top of the screen, T-minus 31 minutes, 25 seconds. A little bit of a discrepancy between that and the countdown you see on the SpaceX timeline. That's because SpaceX's feed is coming through X, which is on a little bit of a delay. So you'll see our countdown clock proceed, and we'll make the calls in real time, since our cameras are all in sync with, of course, real-time sequences out here at Starbase. And you'll see events on a slight delay on the SpaceX feed as we dip in and out of those views. So just want to put that out to our viewers at home as we get ready for liftoff, taking a view in there to SpaceX Mission Control as their flight teams are going through their countdown procedures, getting ready for liftoff. And this appears to be a look, panned away, but that was a little peek into the headquarters of SpaceX in Hawthorne, California. And this is over on South Padre Island, as some folks are waking up, heading down to the water's edge, hoping to see a launch coming up in just over 30 minutes. So as we were getting into the last half hour, Marcus, how are you feeling at this point as we're on the cusp of Starship flying once again?
Yeah, look, I've got the butterflies going already because you know, there's a lot riding on this. We want to obviously see it leave the pad successfully and not cause damage like we saw last time, which I certainly don't think it will. But there's always apprehension in these ones. Super excited when it comes down to it, and yeah, it's coming down very quickly now. Actually, love that long shot that we've got there right now. Just listening in as well to the live stream at the same time to see if they're saying anything sort of interesting there. It's mainly stuff we know. They're talking about that trajectory like we discussed here, not far back.
Yeah, I think we have that trajectory that we can pop over onto the main screen, Stephen, if you don't mind doing that. This will be the nominal flight path of Ship 25 if it does make it past staging and it's able to continue on and flight. It will splash down off the coast of Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean about an hour and a half after liftoff this morning. So all things considered, not a terribly long flight profile, especially considering some of the other missions that SpaceX has undertaken in the not too distant past. But as we've been discussing throughout the course this morning, a number of things that could go wrong, some that could go right, but you know, they take an iterative approach to launch with SpaceX. So as much as they can get through, they will, and they'll learn and they'll turn around for a future flight as, you know, they get ready to launch the third flight test of Starship. And I guess, Zach, do we have any insight at this point as to when SpaceX may or may not start to have payloads on board Starship rocket, or do you imagine they'll continue flying for a while yet still without payloads on board as they just figure out all the mechanics of this rocket?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that having payload is one of their top goals right now. You know, from my point of view, like as long as you know that it's going to reach orbit, you might as well have a payload on there. So they did have some issues with both Ship 24 and Ship 25 with the actual payload section. You know, we never actually saw any issues with it, but I think, you know, being inside of the vehicle, they were able to determine that there were some problems with it. If I had to guess, they probably had some jamming of the door mechanisms or with the actual Starlink PEZ dispensers, and that kind of led to them welding the payload doors shut on both Ship 24 and Ship 25, which was interesting. I think that kind of goes into how much the importance of testing. So, you know, they didn't actually test the payload section until like right now. Actually, I think they have their payload section test article over at the Massey's.
Yeah, we've got John on
For
too.
launch in just over 26 minutes from now. Now, we delayed a day getting here. Yesterday on Friday, we had to replace a discrepant grid fin actuator on the first stage. We also replaced 2 other actuators as a precaution. The stages were remated, checked out, and everything was go for where we are right now this morning. Now, as I mentioned, we are in propellant loading. Both vehicles, the first and second stages, use the same 2 propellants. Our fuel is liquid methane at a temperature of just over 100 Kelvin, or about 272 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. This is a different fuel from Falcon 9, where we use the RP-1 kerosene. But our oxidizer is liquid oxygen, the same as Falcon 9. Because there is no oxygen in space to support combustion, we have to bring our own. We did the weather poll and the go-no-go poll at T-minus 2 hours. We got the goes, and we started loading both propellants on the booster at T-minus 1 hour and 36 minutes. And at T-minus 1 hour and 17 minutes, we began propellant loading of the ship second stage. Propellant loading of the Starship second stage main tanks will complete at approximately T-minus 22 minutes, just a few minutes from now. And at about the same time, we will switch over to loading the header tanks in the nose of the ship. Meanwhile, it'll be T-minus 3 minutes when Super Heavy prop load completes on the first stage. And at that point, all propellant will be on the rocket, fully loaded with over 10 million pounds of propellant. As we near T0, it's worth noting that the timing of the countdown will be slightly different today. For Flight 1, we lit the engines and lifted off about 6 seconds later. For Flight 2, we aim to reduce that time by almost 2 seconds, shortening the period between engine start and liftoff. This will help reduce stress on the ground and the propulsion systems and improve the efficiency of the rocket. Now, right now, we're just inside T-minus 25 minutes to liftoff. The weather and winds are looking good. We haven't had any concerns there. The only issue we're working is getting the small boats out of the near range area in the offshore from Boca Chica Starbase. We do have the possibility of holding at T-minus 40 seconds as we're trying to get the last of the boats out of the safety area. Now, if for some reason we do not make our test flight today, we have a backup launch windows. This could be either 24 or 48 hours after today. It depends on how far we get into the countdown. But for now, everything's looking good as we've passed, coming up on the 24-minute mark. I'll hand it back to you, Kate and Shiva.
Alrighty, so a lot of good updates from John there at SpaceX. We're now at T-minus 23 minutes, 42 seconds and counting. The next big milestone will be at T-minus 19 minutes, 40 seconds when the Raptor engine chill begins. One of the things that jumped out at me that we sort of suspected, but it's nice to hear it from SpaceX, is that should they not be able to launch for whatever reason today, they do have backup opportunities potentially tomorrow as well as Monday. Although for those of us who have traveled in from out of state, I'm sure we're all hoping the launch goes off today and we can make it back on time for Thanksgiving with all of our families. So fingers crossed on a personal level that everything goes ship shape for ship 25 and booster 9. Starting with Marcus, we'll go around the horn again. Anything in particular that stood out from John's comments just now, or was it pretty much all what we were kind of expecting to hear from SpaceX at this point?
Yeah, pretty much what we were expecting. It's good to hear that they are reducing the time on the pad while those engines are firing. That reduction, I think he said, of 2 seconds there, although I was struggling to hear. Yeah, I mean, that's a great thing. It's more performance, it's less pressure on the pad, and yeah, it makes total sense. I mean, ideally they would be firing and leaving the pad within a second or two after this thing gets super routine and that sort of thing. So yeah, that was the only standout part for me. Obviously, the boats being in the way is a frustrating problem, and if they end up being the cause of a delay, these are the things where, you know, SpaceX, I'm sure, would like some of the regulations just relaxed a little bit. Depends where they are, of course. If they're just on the outside or just slightly on the inside of one of the exclusion zones, even though they've all been warned, it's like, you know, arguably they should be able to relax some of those conditions for an event of this magnitude. But you know, look, everybody's doing the best they can. Let's hope they get those boats out of the way.
Zach, anything of note jump out at you, or pretty much on pace with Marcus there as far as what we heard from SpaceX?
Yeah, probably about the same. You know, I guess just to finish the thought from before, you know, I think that we probably should expect to see the payloads potentially, well, I want to say on the next flight, but it won't be like a full payload. It would be more like a possibly a dummy payload of at least a single Starlink V2, and you know, the goal would be to make sure that the actual the payload dispensing mechanism is working as planned. And you know, ideally, if you're launching and you know you're going to make it to orbit, it doesn't really matter what the ship's going to do on the way in. It doesn't matter what the booster is going to do on the way back. As long as you know you're making it to orbit, you may as well be dispensing payloads. And I think that they kind of have that same thought. You know, these are expensive vehicles. You're going to lose 33, possibly up to 39 Raptor engines in the process. So you may as well get some Starlink V2s up in orbit if you can. You know, that's one of the cool things about Starship in comparison to Falcon 9 back in those development days, is that, you know, they can send up their own payloads at this point, so they're not really worried about risk to customers or anything, because they are the customers, so they can pretty much do whatever they want in that regard. And I think that they're going to want to, as I said, start launching Starlinks from Starship as quickly as possible, because you're kind of limited. I think with the V2s, they're limited to what, like 23? Is it 23 that they've been launching lately on the Falcon 9s? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
slightly less from Vandenberg.
Yeah, we have no idea how many Starship is actually going to hold, but it's going to be drastically higher than that. So, you know, I think that, you know, if you can put 4 times the amount of payload with Starship, that you're going to want to do that as quickly as you can.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
23 Starlink V2 minis from the Cape, and currently 22 from Vandenberg that we're seeing right now. Sorry, Marcus, I didn't mean to cut you off. Just 19 minutes, 8 seconds out. We are now underway with the Raptor engine chill sequence. Just want to make a note of that as we are very quickly and on time stepping through this countdown procedure. So all signs going well. Stephen did happen to catch over on the horizon NASA's WB-57 observation plane. Of course, we've talked about the fact that Starship is going to play a very important role in the Artemis program as the human landing system for both Artemis 3 and 4 missions, likely for others down the road, but those are the two that they're currently on contract for. Important, of course, because those will be the first times under the Artemis program that will be bringing humans down to the surface of the moon for the first time since Apollo 17 in 1972. So really important that NASA keeps eyes on this mission and obviously gets good data from it as it learns. Just seeing a quick update from SpaceX. They just posted the video of what the hot staging looks like in an animation. So getting our first official rendering of what this will look like from SpaceX's perspective. Seen a lot of fan renderings floating around online, but now we've got the official one here as we're looking forward to seeing the real thing in in the timeline after liftoff. It'll be about 20 or so minutes from now. And Marcus, I cut you off mid-thought. Go ahead.
No, I don't think you did actually. I wasn't really adding anything to that comment. I'm just sort of listening along to the SpaceX stream there, and they're really putting a lot of emphasis on the hot staging event being the milestone. That's the success milestone as far as they're concerned, and everything else sounds like gravy. I'm just sort of watching that hot staging ring there now. Did it show us how many engines were going to fire? I might have missed that. I don't know if it did.
If any of our folks in the back channels have the answer to that, if you can let us know if they have an answer to that, that'd be great. In the meantime, Stephen had a question for Zach. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, Zach, we heard from John and Swicker that they have backup opportunities. Hopefully they don't have to use them tomorrow or Monday, 24 or 48 hours. I'm curious, Zach, since you closely follow what's going on with the launch facilities and ground infrastructure down here at Starbase, is that feasible? Do they have to bring in tankers to replenish the tank farm? And can they do that in 24 hours?
So I think last time around, they did refill the tank farm after the abort on the 17th. And, I think it appeared that it was like kind of a required thing that they have that much loss in propellant, probably specifically with liquid oxygen, that they needed to, replenish the tank farm. But I think most of that was kind of due to the fact that they were also working with some issues on the booster QD and the hydraulic power unit on the booster. So as far as what we have been able to tell, it seems like they have enough propellant in those tank farms for 2.5 launches. So theoretically, they should not need to replenish. And I guess another thing we found out recently, thanks to that Fish and Wildlife report, was related to how much water they're using. So they have about 360,000 gallons of water for that the active flame deflector system. And I guess they only use about 136,000 gallons during a launch attempt. So theoretically, if they turn on the engines at T-minus 2 seconds or something like that, and they end up having an abort, that water system will already be active. So theoretically you could have to worry about having to refill the water tanks, but I guess we are now a little bit more certain that that won't be an issue, since they should have about 2.5 launches worth of water in those tanks. So during an actual abort, I think it's not impossible at this point that we could expect to see another opportunity tomorrow. So fingers crossed that we don't have to actually worry about that.
And on the official timeline that SpaceX published, the next event is not until the final 10 seconds when the flame deflector that we were just talking about will be activated. But Zach, you were saying as you were looking at some of the previous fueling attempts and static fires that there's the ground gas purge event that's going to come up before then. About how far out from T0 is that going to happen?
So it should be as soon as propellant loading ends. It'll actually look like they started loading fuel again. So what they do is once they finish loading fuel on the ship and booster, they'll actually empty all of the propellant lines that are easily drainable. So there's some that are on the actual GSE arm on the tower. All of that, they have a vent that they can open up and purge all of the liquid oxygen, and same thing on the launch mount. And so after that, they'll actually switch over both the liquid oxygen and liquid methane pumps over to pumping nitrogen, and essentially push that all the way through the system, all the way up to the top of the tower, the top of the launch mount. And you'll actually see them push all of that fluid, at least on the oxygen side, you'll see them push all of that out of the tower and the launch mount. And I think that'll probably, it's tough to say because the wet dress rehearsal didn't go all the way to T-0 or T0, but I don't know. I want to say it's probably within the last 2 minutes. So we'll probably be able to revise that a little bit after this launch of what to expect. It was the first time they tested it on the wet dress rehearsal.
Gotcha. Appreciate the insight.
It was
there.
confirmed, by the way, that all three of the inner gimbaled engines on Starship would gimbal away at stage step, so they'll all fire up, which is what I thought they might do. So, the other thought I had was that it might be 3 vacuums just to get the initial separation going, but it sounds like all 6.
Awesome. Thanks for listening to that, Marcus. T-minus 12 minutes, 15 seconds and counting. We are getting right down to it, coming up on the last 10 minutes here. Want to quickly look at the super chats that have come in and thank a few more folks for supporting our coverage this morning. James G from the Lab Padre stream with a $20 Australian dollar super chat. Thank you so much, James. Really appreciate your support this morning. Marilyn Morgan with a very generous $50 super chat on the Padre stream. Thank you so much, Marilyn. Happy to have you aboard with us this morning. I hope you're enjoying the sights and very soon the many sounds of Starship going up in just a little over 11 and a half minutes. Moving on down the road here, Scat 1975 with a 10 pound sterling super chat. Thank you so much. 1975 says, big love to all the nerds, lab, and RGV crew. Yes, it's been great to work here on the ground with the folks at Lab Padre. Really appreciate the partnership, and also want to just thank again Marcus, Zach, and Steven for being generous with their time this morning as we get ready for launch. Stan J with a $10 super chat with just a rocket and a fire emoji as we're all getting fired up for the launch of Starship, just about 10 and a half minutes away from now. See if I can get a few more in here. Perpetual Nerd with a $5 super chat. Thank you so much from the Lab Padre stream. Says, thanks for the live coverage. Wouldn't miss it. And glad you are here and not missing it. It should be quite an event should they be able to launch this morning. And of course, as John mentioned from SpaceX, they may hold at T-minus 40 seconds, and they do have a 20-minute window. So if the count does pause at that point, never fear, this is not a Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy launch. The commitment to the start of fueling does not mean that they have to stand down. Also want to give another quick thanks as I'm recognizing some of the folks supporting us, Sapphire Condominiums, as well as Isla Grande Beach Resort. Really appreciate that, as we've been getting some great views from north of our position on South Padre Island. Our Adam Bernstein and Chief are also up there getting some of those views for us. If we could bring up the Sapphire view, Stephen, if you wouldn't mind, just to give folks an idea of what that'll look like. Yeah, this is from north of our position here. We are pretty much due west of the orbital launch mount where we're sitting here at the Raptor Roost. Looking forward to launch T-minus 9 minutes, 12 seconds and counting. Go through a few more super chats briefly, and then we'll get back into the conversation. Brian Steele with a $15 Australian dollar super chat. Thank you so much. Says, let's get this bad boy up. 2 thumbs up. Wholeheartedly agree. Christopher Sean with a €10 super chat. No comment, but appreciate the support, Christopher. Thank you.
Over 9 minutes from liftoff as the countdown clock clicks to 0. The teams, good news is, teams aren't working any significant issues on the launch vehicle right now. Propellant loading is continuing on both the Super Heavy and the ship stages. Most recently, we began loading LOX and methane fuel into the header tanks on the Starship. And on the graphic on the left side of the screen, you can see up in the nose of the second stage, what we call Starship, are those 2 header tanks for fuel and liquid oxygen. Now that loading started at T-minus 24 minutes and will continue until approximately T-minus 5.5 minutes. Now Starship's second stage main fuel and LOX tanks are loaded for flight. And the second stage propellant that we're loading on board is going through the quick disconnect that comes out on the arm that's located at the base of the stage from the tower. Now on the Super Heavy booster, propellant loading will continue until T-minus 3 minutes. We've also configured the pad for liftoff. A little earlier in the count, the hold downs, the booster hold downs were commanded to unlatch. That means once the rocket has sufficient thrust to overcome its weight, it'll lift off the pad. There's no need to command the hold downs to release the rocket. As we mentioned earlier also, the ignition sequence has been slightly modified from the last flight for a more efficient liftoff. As a reminder, we ignite the engines a few seconds before T0. We don't lift off exactly at T0. We lift off a few seconds later, a couple seconds. Finally, the SpaceX team continues to check in with the Coast Guard to ensure there are no boats in the safety perimeter before proceeding with launch out over the Gulf of Mexico. Now, currently, we're coming up T-minus 7 minutes, 10 seconds to the test flight of Starship. Propellant loading is continuing on both stages of Starship. We're waiting now for the completion of loading of the header tanks in the next few minutes. The first stage is also beginning pressurization for flight while we are continuing to load propellant into it. And again, booster propellant load will finish at approximately T-minus 3 minutes. At that stage, both first and second stages are fully loaded, and we'll have the 10 million pounds of liquid propellant on board the 2 stages of Starship. Now in the next few minutes, the guidance system will perform its final alignment. We'll get the automated flight termination system that'll arm, and the final TVC checkout will be performed. We may get a view looking up at the engines as we gimbal the 13 middle engines to check them out just before liftoff at about T-minus 90 seconds. If we need to hold, it would come at T-minus 40 seconds. That's the point in the countdown where we can pause to wait for final checkouts or pressurization to complete. Or, as we're hearing right now, we're still working a few boats in the area that are headed south. And a lot of cheering here in Hawthorne. The boats are heading south, but we are still planning to hold at T-minus 40 seconds if necessary.
Just amazing views of today's launch. There's nothing
Well,
quite
sounds like
right.
that's the end of John Ensbacher's update from SpaceX. A lot of good information there. Stephen, as we've encountered, certainly covering launches from the Cape, pesky boats in the water are certainly something that we are not fond of seeing, and it's much more of an intrusive item because the fueling has started and the boats haven't cleared the area. They have no margin for error with Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, but fortunately they can't hold at T-minus 40 seconds. So that's good news if needed, right?
Yeah, exactly right, Will. They have a 20-minute launch window to work with this morning, so they can hold at 40 seconds, I presume, for all 20 minutes if necessary. I'm not sure if there's any limitation on that, but how long they can hold at that point. But they do have that 20-minute launch window to work with, and if the boats are heading in the right direction, we may or may not see a launch at 7, but hopefully we'll see one sometime between 7 and 7:20.
Yeah, and Zach, we've been talking about some of the differences between Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, and Starship. As John also mentioned, because of the way that Starship launches, unlike a Falcon mission, they don't need to issue a hold down release. The Starship is capable of doing that all on its own. What else jumped out from you in the latest update from SpaceX?
Yeah, I mean, that has always been an interesting thing to me that we found out at the last launch, which was, you know, that releasing those hold down clamps early. I guess we always kind of thought it would be, you know, ignition, release the hold down clamps. But I guess, you know, having just the sheer weight of the vehicle sitting on those clamps is about enough, all you need. You know, it kind of makes sense. You know, you don't want any possible risk of failure of that, so release them as early as possible and essentially just let the vehicle lift off the pad without having anything holding it down. So, you know, that's going to be really awesome to see once again. You know, I do think it's interesting having those boats out there in the exclusion zone, which doesn't really surprise me. I think some people are probably trying to get out there to the recovery zone, which I would maybe advise against, because you never know what this thing is going to do once it's in the air. But yeah, I mean, it seems like everything is good to go. I can tell right now they have finished loading propellant on both the ship and booster. They just finished purging the launch tower, it seems like. So I would say they're finished, at least on the ship for sure. I can't really tell on the booster because there's a lot of fog going here, but yeah, we're getting really close right now. It's you know, time to get excited.
Absolutely. And Marcus, did anything else that we haven't already touched on jump out at you? I know you've been able to listen a little more keenly and through both John's updates on fueling as well as some of the SpaceX general commentary.
No, look, not particularly. That hasn't already been covered. The you know, they're obviously going right now through various explanations of how big the ship is and why this is important and all this kind of stuff. They've got a great animation of you know, Mechazilla, like an animated Mechazilla coming over, walking past. So you know, these cool sort of insights that they're sharing for those that probably aren't as closely up to speed with what this all means, which is great for the general public. You know, this is why we want people to be interested.
Absolutely. And speaking of interested, we see, as you mentioned, the little hard to see through the venting there, but might be doing the gimbling on those center engines. A little hard to tell if there is in fact motion. Now T-minus 1 minute 27 seconds and counting. Again, they may hold at T-minus 40 seconds, but all things being equal, gentlemen, we are closing in on the last couple of minutes before Starship heads off.
Yeah, they're just moving the engines now.
There you go. 10 seconds around the horn to each of you. We'll start with Marcus, then go to Zach, then to Steven. Final thoughts as we enter in the last minute of the count, quickly.
Yeah, look, I've got everything crossed. This is incredibly important, and you know, we just need this to clear the tower. Zach, what do you think?
As we're coming up on T-minus 1 minute, when we get to T-minus 40 seconds, we'll just listen in. Last time, as you recall, we did hold at 40 seconds, but it took a few seconds for the clock to recover, so we're going to watch that. And as we press to T0, we're going to watch and listen the second test flight of Starship.
Yeah, I guess really quick. You know, I'm excited for this. I think this is a big day. If this goes well, we're they're holding.
Anticipation.
Yeah.
Some of the brief holds. Our countdown clock is moving forward.
Still counting down.
All right, we're 10.
T-minus 30 seconds.
8, 7, 6, 5,
Back to rapid recycle.
4, 3. Okay, the clock is not accurate. It may actually be in a hold. Okay.
Looks like they've gone back to 41.
All right, so the hold was called. It looked like it came on, came off, and is back on again.
Looks like it. Whew.
Got me excited there for a second.
I know, we were counting down.
Back at
Sounds like,
Hawthorne, we're
wait,
at T-minus 40 seconds in holding. We had a rapid recycle. We've not heard anything over the countdown net as the team works both first and second stages. We're going to monitor the nets here for a minute.
All right, so we are, as it appeared, in a holding pattern. course, just as a reminder for anyone who may have joined in the live streams here, either on the Lab Padres side or the
Got a little bit of an
Spaceflight Now
update.
side.
We're continuing to hold at T-minus 40 seconds. This is the normal hold point for Starship, as we talked earlier. Sounds like we're working just late pressurization on, I believe, the second stage. Team is working it. All the other systems are on hold right now at 40 seconds. We can hold here for about 15 minutes or so before we would run out of window for this morning. So right now they're working on filling pressure vessels. And ideally we'll be able to solve this and come back and release the clock at T-minus 40 seconds. We're going to continue to listen and monitor for another few minutes.
Come on.
So hearing from John that, of course, the hold is something that they planned for, that they have time for, not infinite time.
And
As you mentioned,
it's
they
worth
have about
mentioning here that
15
don't go
minutes
away.
that
We
they
are
can
holding.
hold. So we will continue to keep eyes on, and of course, if John Isbacher pops back in with an update, we will listen to that and talk about any of the pertinent updated information. But that'll set up the hot staging at T plus 2 minutes 41 seconds. The milestone SpaceX was not able to reach last time